There is a moment, somewhere deep in the dead hours of the night, when a security guard stops making rounds and simply stands still listening because something in the air has changed, and every animal instinct they possess is screaming at them that they are no longer alone. Welcome back. If you're new here, settle in, because this channel is your home for the kind of stories that make the darkness feel just a little bit closer. The kind that get under your skin, not because they're impossible, but because they're not. I'm glad you found us tonight. Go ahead and pull your blanket up a little higher. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Put on your headphones if you've got them, because tonight's stories are best heard when the rest of the world has gone quiet. Tonight, we're talking about security guards. Think about what that job actually means for a moment. You are paid often not very well to be the last line of defense between the world and whatever it is you're protecting. You walk the same empty hallways over and over again, night after night, memorizing every shadow, every sound, every creak and hiss and groan of a building that breathes differently when no one else is in it. You learn the personality of a place. You get comfortable. And comfort, as any experienced night shift worker will tell you, is exactly when things go wrong. Here's something most people don't know. Security professionals report unexplained incidents far more frequently than any other nighttime profession. More than nurses, more than truck drivers, more than hotel staff. Something about the combination of isolation, darkness, and the sheer amount of time spent alone in spaces that weren't designed for solitude seems to create the perfect conditions for encounters that don't have easy explanations. I want to say thank you, genuinely, for being here tonight. This channel exists because of you, because of the people who understand that there's something deeply human about gathering in the dark and sharing stories that scare us just enough to remind us we're alive. If these stories speak to you, please take a second to hit that like button. It helps more people find their way to our little corner of the night. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It genuinely means the world. Now, tonight I have 3 stories for you. 3 accounts, shared by 3 different people, from 3 very different places. All of them worked nights. All of them thought they understood the spaces they were protecting. All of them were wrong. Stay with me until the very end. The last story is the one that keeps me up. Let's begin. Our first story comes from a man named Marcus, who spent 3 years working overnight security at a sprawling shopping mall in the Midwest. He'd walked those empty corridors hundreds of times without incident, until the night he noticed that one of the stores had a customer inside it that simply could not be there. What he did next, and what he found in the hours that followed, changed how he understood fear, and changed how he understood the buildings he thought he knew. Our second story is from a woman named Delia, who worked the graveyard shift at a long-term care storage facility on the outskirts of a mid-sized city in Texas. She was the only living person in a building that held the belongings of the dead, the estates of people who had passed, waiting to be claimed or auctioned. She thought the hardest part of the job would be the loneliness. She was wrong about what the hardest part would be. And our third story, the one that has stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit, comes from a retired security officer named Paul, who spent the final 18 months of his career guarding a decommissioned hospital in rural Pennsylvania. He'd worked in security for 22 years before that posting. He quit the profession entirely after it. He has never spoken publicly about what happened in that building until now. 3 stories, 3 long nights. Let's go. Marcus Hale was 34 years old when he took the overnight position at Westfield Crossing Mall, and he'll be the first to tell you that he took the job because it was easy. That's not a criticism, that's just honesty. He'd spent the previous 6 years working construction and 2 bad winters and a lower back injury that never quite healed the way the doctors said it would. He had left him needing something he could do on his feet without destroying himself. Security seemed like the answer. Westfield Crossing wasn't a particularly large mall, as malls go. It sat on the edge of a suburb called Fairvale, Ohio, the kind of suburb that exists in that particular mid-American way, where there are chain restaurants and car dealerships and a Walmart, and then, gradually, fields. The mall itself had been built in the early 1980s and had the bones of that era. Wide corridors with geometric tile floors in faded colors of burnt orange and harvest gold. Skylights that let in the gray Ohio sky during the day and the black Ohio sky at night, and a food court that smelled perpetually of old cooking oil and cinnamon sugar, even when the stores hadn't been open for 12 hours. Marcus liked it. He's clear about that. He genuinely liked working there. His shift ran from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. When he arrived, the last of the closing crew, the janitors, the store managers locking up, the handful of food court workers mopping their stations were usually still around for the first hour or so. By 11:30, he was alone. Just him and about 200,000 square feet of empty retail space, connected by those long orange and gold corridors, with the humming fluorescent lights and the silence that was never quite complete, because a building that size has its own sounds, its own language, and Marcus learned to speak it. The HVAC system had a rhythm. It cycled on with a low groan every 20 minutes or so, pushed air through the ducts for a while, and then sighed off into quiet. The security shutters on the stores, those steel roll-down gates, ticked and shifted as the temperature dropped overnight. There were 3 water features in the mall. A small fountain in the center atrium that was turned off each night at closing, and 2 decorative wall-mounted water walls near the east and west entrances that ran on timers and shut down at 10. When those went off, the sudden removal of the sound of trickling water always made the silence feel bigger. Marcus did 4 full circuits of the mall per night, plus hourly checks on the exterior doors. The circuit took him about 45 minutes at a leisurely pace. He'd start at the security office, a small room tucked behind the management suites near the north entrance, walk the full length of the main corridor to the south end, loop back through the secondary corridor that ran parallel, check the food court, cross through the center atrium with its dark fountain, and return. He knew every foot of that route. He knew which tiles had slight lips that could catch your toe if you weren't paying attention. He knew which store had a motion-activated light inside that would flash on when he passed, startling him every single time. No matter how many months he worked there, it was a bridal shop called Cecilia's, and something about the angle of the sensor meant it caught movement in the corridor. He knew that the Foot Locker near the east wing always smelled faintly of rubber, even with its gate down, and that the Barnes & Noble at the south end had a display of wind-up toys in the window that occasionally got jostled by something vibrations from the HVAC, maybe, and would start ticking and spinning on their own in the middle of the night if you happened to be walking past. He knew all of it. He owned that space, in the comfortable way that a person owns a place they've spent hundreds of quiet hours. He had 2 colleagues on the overnight. A woman named Sharita, who worked the security desk from a small booth at the main entrance and monitored the cameras, and an older man named Don, who was technically the shift supervisor, but who spent most of his nights doing crossword puzzles in the management office and checking in by radio every couple of hours. It was a comfortable arrangement, a quiet arrangement. For the first 8 months, nothing happened that would be worth telling anyone about. He ate his lunches in the security office, usually a sandwich from home or takeout from the one 24-hour diner that existed in Fairvale, a place called Mel's that made decent coffee and had a rotating display of pie slices under a glass dome that Marcus sometimes thought about during the slow hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. He listened to podcasts on his earbuds during the quiet stretches, keeping one ear always alert to the radio. He took photographs of the mall's changing window displays and sent them to his sister, who lived in Seattle, and collected what she called evidence of beautiful American sadness. He killed a spider the size of a quarter in the secondary corridor one night in September, and considered it the most dramatic thing that had happened during his entire tenure. He was comfortable. He was at home. He belonged to that mall in the way a person can belong to a place that isn't particularly remarkable, simply because they've spent enough time in it to make it theirs. His co-worker Sharita had worked the desk at Westfield Crossing for 6 years, since long before Marcus arrived, and she knew the building in her own way, from the fixed perspective of the cameras. She could tell you from memory which camera covered which angle, where the blind spots were, which stores had their own interior cameras that occasionally created interference on the external feeds. She was a calm, observant woman who kept a crossword book in her desk drawer and could tell the difference between a passing car's headlights crossing the parking lot camera and the motion of a raccoon near the east entrance, dumpsters without looking. Up from her puzzle. She was, Marcus thought, the kind of person you most wanted beside you when things got complicated. Steady, unflappable. Dawn, the supervisor, was a different matter. Don was 61 years old and had been in loss prevention and facility security since his mid-20s, and he had achieved, over those decades, a thoroughgoing philosophical indifference to anything he couldn't resolve through the application of common sense and paperwork. He believed in protocols. He believed in documentation. He believed that most inexplicable things had explicable causes that just hadn't been located yet, and he held this belief with the cheerful certainty of a man whose worldview had never been seriously challenged. Marcus liked him fine. He was reliable, experienced, and completely unequipped for what was about to happen. Then came the Tuesday night in February. It was cold outside, in the way that Ohio Februaries get cold. Not dramatically, not with blizzards or ice storms. Just a constant, bone-deep, gray coldness that made the inside of the mall feel particularly warm and cave-like by contrast. Marcus arrived at 9:50, signed in, exchanged a few words with Sharita, who was wrapping up a thermos of coffee and settling in for the night, and began his first circuit at 10:15 after the last of the closing crew had filtered out. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it always was. The HVAC groaned to life somewhere above him. The tiles clicked under his boots. Cecilia's bridal shop lit up as he passed, the white and ivory gowns on their mannequins glowing for a startled moment, before he moved out of range, and the light went dark again. He did the south end, came back through the secondary corridor, checked the food court chairs upended on tables, the smell of old fryer oil, one of the overhead lights doing its usual stuttering thing near the Panda Express, and was crossing the center atrium when he happened to glance to his right. The atrium had a cluster of stores on its east side, a Hallmark, a phone case kiosk that had been folded up and locked for the night, a sunglasses boutique called Shades of Blue, and a mid-range jewelry store called Carver & Sons that had been in that spot since the mall opened. Carver & Sons had a large display window, fully lit from inside. Even when closed, they kept the interior lighting on overnight as a deterrent, which Marcus had always thought was smart. The window was full of the usual arrangement. Velvet display stands with rings and necklaces and bracelets on them, a large rotating pedestal in the center, showing off a set of diamond pieces. And there was someone standing inside the store. Marcus stopped walking. He stood there in the center of the atrium, about 30 feet from the Carver & Sons window, and he looked at the figure standing inside the darkened back half of the store, just beyond the reach of the display lighting. His first thought, honestly, was that a staff member had forgotten something and come back. That happened sometimes. Employees would realize at 11 or midnight that they'd left a phone charger or a purse or their medication, and they'd call the security desk, and Sharita would radio Marcus, and he'd meet them at the appropriate entrance and let them retrieve their item. It was inconvenient, but not uncommon. But Sharita hadn't radioed him, and the figure inside Carver & Sons wasn't moving toward the door or toward any part of the store where they might have left something. They were just standing there, mostly in shadow, facing the display window, facing Marcus. He told himself he was misreading the angle. The figure was probably turned sideways, or looking at the display, or doing something entirely normal that just looked weird through glass at this hour. He took a few steps forward to get a better look, and as he did, the figure didn't move, didn't react to him approaching, just stood there in the dim back section of the store, very still. Marcus keyed his radio. "Hey, Sharita, you get a call from anyone at Carver & Sons tonight? Manager or staff coming back for something?" The radio crackled. "Negative. Nobody's called in." "Why?" "I'm looking at somebody standing inside the store right now." A pause. Then, "Say again?" "There's a person standing inside Carver & Sons. Can you pull up the interior camera?" Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus stood in the atrium, watching the figure through the window, and the figure continued to not move, which was the part that was beginning to bother him most. If it were a person, a real, ordinary person in there, for innocent reasons they would have noticed him by now. They would have knocked on the glass, or waved, or shown some sign of awareness that they were being observed by the security guard standing 30 feet away. "Marcus." Sharita's voice came back on the radio, and something in her tone had shifted. "I'm looking at the Carver & Sons interior feed. I'm not seeing anyone on camera." Marcus looked at the window. The figure was still there. "Sharita, I'm telling you, I'm looking right at somebody, and I'm telling you the interior camera shows an empty store." He stood there with the radio in his hand, looking at the store, and the rational part of his brain began working through the possibilities. A blind spot. In the camera, a mannequin he hadn't noticed before. Maybe Carver & Sons had added a display piece recently. A trick of the light. The angle of the glass creating a reflection of something behind him. He turned around. The atrium behind him was empty. Just the dark fountain, with its copper pennies at the bottom, and the corridor stretching away toward the north entrance. He turned back to the window. The figure was still there. Marcus made himself walk to the store. He pressed his face close to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to cut the glare, and peered inside. The figure was standing maybe 20 feet back from the window, in the area between the display cases and the door to the back office. It was dark enough back there that he couldn't make out details. He could see the shape of a person, the suggestion of height and proportion, but not a face, not clothing, nothing specific. It was the posture that convinced him most strongly that it was a real person and not a mannequin or a trick of light. It had the loose, organic quality of a body at rest. Weight distributed naturally. A slight suggestion of breathing. Mannequins stood differently. They had a rigidity, a perfection of posture that human beings at rest never actually achieved. But the camera showed nothing. He called Don on the radio and explained the situation, and Don made his way from the management office with considerably less urgency than Marcus would have liked. When Don arrived, he looked through the glass, squinted, said, and then radioed Sharita to have her flip between camera angles. "East display camera," Sharita said over the radio. Nothing. "Back office camera. Nothing. West display camera. Wait. What?" Don said. "The west display camera is showing some kind of obstruction, like something's blocking the lens." Don looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Don. "Could be spider webs," Don said. "Get over there all the time. Camera's been showing staticky for a couple weeks. I've been meaning to put in a maintenance request." "What about the figure?" Marcus said. Don looked through the window again. "I see something," he admitted. "But it could be a display piece. They rearrange their cases every few weeks." "Carver's doesn't use mannequins," Marcus said. "I've worked here 8 months. They've never had a mannequin." Don didn't have a good answer for that. They stood there for another full minute, the two of them, looking through the glass at the thing that was standing in the dark back half of the jewelry store, and the thing did not move, and neither of them could fully convince themselves of what it was. Eventually, Don said that Marcus should finish his circuit, that they'd call Carver's management in the morning, and that it was almost certainly a new display piece or a reflection. Marcus wanted to push back on this, but Don was his supervisor, and the tone of Don's voice had the particular quality of someone who has decided not to be unsettled by something and is going to hold that position by force of will. So Marcus finished his circuit. He did not look through the Carver & Sons window again on his way back. He made a deliberate choice not to look, and he was not proud of that choice, but he made it. The second thing happened about an hour and a half later. He was in the food court doing his 2 a.m. check, moving through the rows of upended chairs and dark restaurant shutters, when he heard footsteps. This was so unexpected that he stopped moving immediately and stood completely still, and in the sudden silence, the footsteps continued for 2 or 3 seconds, and then also stopped. They had been coming from the direction of the main corridor, the long stretch that connected the food court to the center atrium. Marcus keyed his radio. "Dawn? Sharita? Anyone moving around in the building right now besides me?" "Dawn. Negative. I'm in the office." "Sharita. I'm in the booth. What's going on?" I heard footsteps in the main corridor. A brief silence. "I'm cycling through the corridor cameras," Sharita said. "Main corridor, nothing. North section, nothing. Center atrium, Marcus. I've got you in the food court. Nothing else moving." He stood in the food court and listened. Nothing. The HVAC. The distant sound of the ventilation system. Silence. He walked to the entrance of the food court and looked down the main corridor. It stretched away from him in both directions, empty. The fluorescent lights humming their steady hum, the tile floor reflecting the light in dull orange and gold. Nothing moved, but something was different. It took him a moment to figure out what it was, and when he did, a cold feeling moved through him that had nothing to do with the February temperature outside. The Barnes & Noble was at the far end of the corridor, maybe 150 feet from where he was standing. Its display window was lit from inside. The same way Carver & Sons kept their lighting on a security measure, the store management had explained, because books could be damaged by condensation if the climate control ran without internal heat sources overnight. The wind-up toys in the window were moving. Not all of them, just a few. A small tin drummer was beating its drum. A mechanical bird was opening and closing its wings. The spinning ballerina in the center of the display was turning, slowly, her metal face catching the light on every rotation. Marcus had worked there for 8 months, and he knew those toys. He knew that occasionally vibrations from the building would set them off. He knew they were supposed to do this sometimes, that it was normal, that there was an explanation. But he also knew, and this was the thing that made his stomach drop, that he hadn't walked past that window in the last hour. He'd come from the north end. He hadn't been near the Barnes & Noble. There had been no vibrations from his footsteps to trigger those toys. Something else had walked past them. He radioed Sharita. "The south end of the main corridor? Any movement in the last 10 minutes? I've been watching the corridor, Marcus. There's nothing on camera." He stared at the toys turning in the window from 150 feet away, and he thought about the footsteps he'd heard, and he thought about the figure in the jewelry store, and he made himself start walking toward the south end to check. He checked. Nothing. No one. The Barnes & Noble window, when he reached it, showed only still toys. Whatever had been running down had wound itself out. The tin drummer was silent. The bird was folded. The ballerina had stopped spinning. But here was the thing, the small, wrong thing, that he has never been able to explain. One of the toys had moved, not in the sense of its mechanical action, in the sense of its physical location in the window. There was a small tin music box in the shape of a little house, with a scene of a family inside. Mother, father, 2 children painted on its face. Marcus knew exactly where that music box sat in the display, because he'd looked at it dozens of times on his rounds. It had always been in the left side of the window, tucked between a larger toy train and a stack of children's books. It was now in the center of the display, not close to the center, not shifted a couple of inches, It was in the exact center of the window, sitting by itself. The painted family, on its face, looking outward, through the glass. Marcus stood in the empty corridor and stared at that little tin house, and the silence of the mall pressed in around him from all sides, and he thought, that wasn't there. That was not there before. He got on his radio. He told Dawn and Sharita what he was looking at. Sharita confirmed that the south corridor camera had shown no movement. Dawn told him to finish his rounds and write it up in the incident log. He wrote it up. He finished his rounds. He did not see the figure in the Carver & Sons window again that night. But the third thing happened just before 5 in the morning, when the building was at its darkest and quietest, about an hour before the first early morning delivery crews would start arriving. Marcus was in the secondary corridor, the one that ran parallel to the main corridor on the west side of the building, less well lit, used mostly for access to storage rooms and service entrances. He was about halfway through when his flashlight caught something on the floor. It was a set of footprints. Not shoe prints, footprints, bare feet, pressed into something that had spilled in the corridor. The custodial team mopped every night, and they used a cleaning solution that dried mat and left a faint residue on the tile. The footprints were pressed into that residue, clear as anything. The arch, the toe prints, the heel, adult-sized, bare, leading toward the door to the utility corridor that connected to the mall's basement level, away from any entrance or exit, away from any store, coming from nowhere, Marcus could identify, and leading to a door that was supposed to be locked. He tested the door with his hand, without touching the handle fully, a habit from training, so as not to disturb evidence if it came to that, and felt it move. It was unlocked. He did not open the door. He took 3 steps back from it, keyed his radio, and said, "Dawn, I need you in the secondary corridor, west side, near the utility access. Now, please." Dawn's voice came back sounding annoyed and half asleep. "What is it, Marcus? There's bare footprints on the floor leading to the utility door, and the utility door is unlocked. I need you here." The quality of Dawn's voice changed. "I'm coming." While he waited, Marcus stood in the secondary corridor with his flashlight pointed at the door and listened. He could hear nothing from behind it. The utility corridor beyond it led to the basement level, which contained the mall's mechanical systems, the HVAC units, the electrical systems, the water mains. It was a space that wasn't part of any regular patrol, because it was always kept locked and there was nothing of value down there except infrastructure. It was also, Marcus realized, a space he hadn't checked since he'd started working there. Why would he? The door was always locked. He thought about that. He stood in the corridor and he thought about it. And the thought that came to him, the one he didn't want, was, how long? How long had that door been unlocked? How long had something been going down there? Dawn arrived, took in the footprints, tried the door, confirmed it was unlocked, and then did something Marcus hadn't expected. He called the police. In 8 months of working together, Marcus had never seen Dawn call the police. He'd always handled things in-house, always found a reason why the external authorities weren't necessary. Seeing him reach for his phone and dial calmly, efficiently, without discussion, told Marcus that Dawn was more alarmed than he was showing. 2 patrol officers arrived within 15 minutes. They were young, both of them, Marcus thought. Probably not much past their mid-20s. They had the professionally calm demeanor of people trained to walk into unknowns, and when Marcus showed them the footprints and the unlocked door, they exchanged a look and drew their weapons. They went through the door first. Marcus and Dawn followed at a distance. The utility corridor was concrete and pipes, and the smell of old metal and stale air. A single string of work lights ran along the ceiling, and one of the officers hit the switch inside the door, bringing them up to a dim orange glow. The corridor ran maybe 60 feet before opening into the main basement level a wide, low-ceilinged space full of machinery. The officers moved through it in the way they were trained to, measured, careful, covering each other. Marcus and Don stood near the entrance to the main space and watched. And then one of the officers, the shorter of the two, a young woman named, he would later learn, Officer Yates, stopped moving. She'd reached the far side of the basement, where the large HVAC unit stood, and she'd found something. She didn't say anything immediately. She just stopped, and her partner moved up beside her, and he stopped too. "Sir," Officer Yates said, turning toward Marcus and Don. Her voice was absolutely level. "Is there supposed to be a mattress down here?" Marcus and Don looked at each other. "A what?" Don said. "A mattress. And sir, is there supposed to be food down here? Bottled water? Clothing?" Marcus walked across the basement toward them, and what he saw in the space behind the largest HVAC unit was a small but complete camp. A single mattress, old, stained, clearly not new, on the concrete floor. Several plastic jugs of water, a cardboard box with canned goods and what appeared to be crackers and dried fruit, a folded pile of clothing, a battery-powered lantern, switched off, a bucket with a lid on it, placed in the corner. Someone had been living in the basement of the mall. Officer Yates was already on her radio, calling for backup and a search. Her partner was moving back toward the utility corridor entrance, checking the space behind the machinery units. Don was standing very still with his hands in his pockets, and the expression on his face was not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it, a kind of deep, retrospective dread. The look of someone recalculating a situation with information they didn't previously have. Marcus stood and looked at the little camp, and he thought about the figure in the jewelry store. He thought about the footsteps in the main corridor. He thought about the music box moved to the center of the window. He thought about someone living in this basement. Someone who knew the building, maybe knew it very well, had learned its rhythms and its cameras and its patterns, and who had been moving through the mall at night for God knows how long, watching him, learning him. The additional officers arrived within 10 minutes. They searched the entire building. They found, in the women's restroom on the north end, a secondary stash, more clothing, a cell phone with a cracked screen, a toiletry kit. They found a length of thin wire that had been threaded through the shutter mechanism of a small accessories store called Bead & Co. in a way that would allow the shutter to be lifted from outside the store, was small enough that it connected through an interior door to a service corridor, and the service corridor connected to the utility access. They found no one. Whatever person had been living there was gone. The cameras, when they reviewed the full night's footage in the days that followed, showed a malfunction in exactly 4 segments. The Carver & Sons interior west camera, the south corridor camera near Barnes & Noble, the secondary corridor west camera, and the basement utility camera. All 4 had experienced signal dropout between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. that night. The maintenance logs showed that the cameras had not malfunctioned on any previous night. The police concluded that the camera drops were deliberate, that whoever had been living there had found a way to interrupt the signals, had known which cameras to target, and had done so with enough technical knowledge to make it look like ordinary equipment failure. They never found out who it was. The mall's security protocol was overhauled completely in the weeks that followed. The utility corridors were fitted with new locks, motion sensor cameras, and secondary alarm contacts. The basement was added to the standard patrol route. Sharita got an upgraded monitoring system with redundant feeds. In the weeks following, Marcus spent a lot of time thinking about the geometry of what he'd learned. He thought about the duct system and the grate over the main corridor. And he thought about what it would feel like to lie on a mattress in a basement, knowing that just above you, just overhead, through a duct that was barely wider than a person's shoulders, someone was making their hourly rounds. He thought about the discipline required to exist in that space, to lie still, to move only when movement was safe, to learn the schedule and the patterns of the guards well enough to time every excursion with precision. He thought about the months, maybe longer, during which that had been happening without anyone knowing. The maintenance records, when they were pulled, showed that the utility corridor door had last been formally checked 9 months before Marcus was hired. The lock at that point had been intact. At some point in the intervening time, someone had compromised it. And then, for the entirety of Marcus's tenure, and God knows how long before that, had been using the basement as a home. The forensic team found something in the basement that the initial search had missed. A small notebook tucked under the outer shell of one of the HVAC units. The notebook was thin, spiral-bound, the kind you'd buy at a drugstore, and it had been used as a journal. Most of the pages were water-damaged and unreadable, but the last legible page contained a list, written in a small, careful hand. Marcus never saw the list. The police didn't share it with him. What he knows is that the lead detective, after reviewing it, immediately escalated the case to a different level of urgency and initiated a broader investigation. He was never told what was on that list. He has spent years choosing not to speculate. Marcus went back to work. He went back to his circuits, his 45-minute loops, his familiar route through the corridors he thought he knew. He went back to nodding at Cecilia's bridal shop with its startling motion light, back to checking the Barnes & Noble window on every pass, back to standing in the atrium and looking at the dark fountain. He kept working there for another 14 months. Nothing else happened. But there were things he couldn't unthink. The mattress in the basement had been positioned so that its occupant, lying on it, would have been looking directly up at a ventilation grate in the ceiling. That grate connected to a duct. That duct ran to the main corridor. Marcus looked into it later, on a day shift when the maintenance crew had the duct access open, and discovered that from the right position in the duct, which was wide enough, just barely, for a person to fit, you could see the floor of the main corridor through the grate slats. You could watch someone walk past without them knowing you were there. The other thing, the thing that Marcus still thinks about, is the music box, the tin house, with the painted family. He asked the Barnes & Noble manager about it days later. The manager confirmed that no staff member had moved it, that displays weren't changed overnight, that it had been in the left side of the window for weeks. They never found an explanation for why it had moved to the center. Marcus has one theory, and he'll share it when asked, though he doesn't love sharing it. He thinks whoever was in that basement walked past the Barnes & Noble window that night, triggered the wind-up toys, just like his footsteps would have, and looked at the display, and moved the music box, placed it in the center, where it could be seen, where the family on its face would be looking out. He thinks it was a message. He has never been able to say with certainty what the message was. He just knows that when he finally left that job, the thing he remembered most wasn't the figure in the jewelry store, or the footsteps, or even the hidden camp in the basement. It was the image of that small tin house sitting alone in the center of the window, its painted family staring out through the glass at an empty corridor, waiting for someone to look back. If Marcus's story has you pulling your blanket a little tighter, I understand. There's something about the idea of a familiar place hiding an unfamiliar presence of safety, being an illusion constructed by nothing more than routine that gets into the part of the brain that doesn't respond well to logic. Our next story is different in setting and in some ways quieter. But quiet, as you've already learned tonight, can be the most unsettling thing of all. A woman named Delia worked alone in a building full of things that belonged to the dead. And one night, something in that building reminded her that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Delia Voss was 51 years old when she took the overnight position at Meridian Storage Solutions. And she would tell you, did tell me, in fact, over the course of several hours of conversation, that she was not a superstitious woman. She said this not defensively, but as a point of established personal history. She'd grown up in a household that didn't trade in ghost stories or old superstitions. She'd worked practical jobs her whole adult life, and she had what she described as a fundamental respect for the knowable. She liked things she could measure and explain. This made what happened to her particularly difficult to process. Meridian Storage Solutions was not a typical storage facility. It wasn't the kind of place where you rent a unit to store your furniture between apartments, or where a small business keeps its overflow inventory. Meridian specialized in estate storage specifically, in the storage of personal property from estates that were in legal limbo. When someone died and their estate was in probate, when family members were disputing inheritance, when an executor was working through a complex will, the physical property of the deceased had to go somewhere safe and climate-controlled and legally accountable. That's what Meridian did. They stored the possessions of the dead. The facility was a large, low building on the east side of a city called Garland, Texas. If you know the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you know Garland, or at least you know its character. Industrial, practical, uncomplicated, Meridian sat in a stretch of commercial property between a plumbing supply warehouse and a food distribution center. And it looked like what it was: a secure storage building with good climate control, excellent security cameras, and a reputation for discretion. Delia had gotten the job through a former colleague who worked in the legal field and knew Meridian's operations director. The pay was decent, not spectacular, but decent, and the job requirements suited her situation. She was a night person by nature, her kids were grown, and she lived alone in a house that felt larger than it needed to be since her husband's death 2 years prior. The overnight position offered structure, income, and something she hadn't fully acknowledged she was looking for: purpose, a reason to get up, or in this case, to stay awake. Her shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. The facility manager, a careful, meticulous man named Gerald, walked her through everything on her first night: the camera system, the alarm contacts on every exterior door, the procedure for checking unit locks, the logs she was required to keep, the numbers to call for any variety of situation. The building had 112 storage units on 3 temperature-controlled wings, designated A, B, and C. Each unit was individually alarmed. The central security console was in a small office at the main entrance, and from there, Delia could see camera feeds for all 3 wings and the exterior. Gerald showed her one more thing before he left on that first night, and he showed it to her with a particular care that she noticed. "These units here," he said, indicating a cluster of 8 units at the far end of Wing C, "are what we call legacy holds. They've been with us a long time, in some cases over a decade. The legal situations are complicated: disputed estates, missing heirs, contested wills. The property in these units may be with us for some time yet." He paused. "I want you to know that some of the items in those units are significant. Heirlooms, art, personal effects with real sentimental weight. Some of these families," he stopped again, choosing his words, "some of these families feel very strongly about their belongings. We've had family members attempt unauthorized access. We've had people show up at odd hours claiming they have rights to particular items. If you ever have any doubt about who should or shouldn't be in this building, your protocol is to call me first and the police second." Delia told him she understood. She was a practical woman. She appreciated clear protocols. Her first 3 weeks were uneventful in the way that the right kind of work can be uneventful: orderly, purposeful, and quietly satisfying. She did her rounds. She kept her log. She drank tea from a thermos she brought from home and listened to audiobooks during the quiet stretches. The facility had a stillness to it at night that she found, not to her surprise, peaceful rather than eerie. She had spent 2 years grieving in a house full of her late husband's belongings. A building full of other people's belongings felt, to her, like familiar territory. She liked the way the storage units lined the corridors in their tidy, sealed rows. She liked knowing what was in each one, or at least knowing in the categorical sense the way the intake forms described them. Wing A was mostly furniture and household goods, the neutral estates of people who had died with manageable circumstances. One heir, clear wills, property moving through probate without dispute. Wing B was more varied. Some business property, some collections, a few larger items, including a boat trailer and a vintage motorcycle, locked behind the double-width unit at the end. Wing C was the quiet one, the legacy holds, the unresolved ones. Delia had been in cemeteries that felt less final than Wing C. She noticed, in those first weeks, that the other Meridian employees, the daytime staff, the occasional visiting estate attorney, or court-appointed assessor, moved through Wing C with a particular efficiency. Not fear, just efficiency. They came in, did what they needed to do, and left. No one lingered in Wing C. No one stopped to look at a unit number longer than necessary. It was the kind of behavior you don't notice until you're looking for it. The unconscious body language of people who have spent enough time in a place to have developed a relationship with its atmosphere, and who have chosen, without discussing it, to keep that relationship at a professional distance. Delia noticed it. She was, by nature, an observer. She said nothing about it. She told me this with a slight, rueful smile. She said, "I thought I was comfortable with the idea of death's leftovers. I thought I understood that kind of silence." She paused. I was about to get a different education. The thing about being a practical, non-superstitious person is that when something strange happens, you work very hard to find the practical explanation. This is generally a strength. It is also, in certain specific situations, a mechanism that can delay an appropriate response. The first thing Delia noticed was a smell. It happened on her 22nd night on the job, a Thursday in early October. She was doing her 2 a.m. round of Wing C, the wing with the legacy holds at the far end, and somewhere around Unit C7, she caught a scent that didn't belong. It was faint and hard to categorize, something old and slightly sweet, with an undertone that she associated, though she couldn't have said exactly why, with paper, old paper. The smell of a library or an antique shop, overlaid with something else she couldn't name. Meridian's Wing C was climate-controlled to a degree of precision that most homes couldn't match. Temperature and humidity were held constant to protect the property stored there. The air was carefully filtered. It didn't smell like much of anything, certainly not like old paper, and something sweetly unidentifiable. Delia stopped walking and stood in the corridor and breathed in carefully, trying to locate the source. It wasn't coming from any particular unit she could identify. It was just there, in the air, as if it had drifted in from somewhere and hadn't dissipated yet. She walked the rest of Wing C, logged her round, and returned to the office. The smell didn't follow her. By the time she reached the main entrance, she'd half convinced herself she'd imagined it, or that it was some artifact of the HVAC system, a filter that needed changing, an old smell, disturbed from somewhere in the ductwork. The second night she noticed it, she was more careful. It was 6 nights later. She was in Wing C again at her 2 a.m. round, and as she passed C7, the smell was there again. Old paper, and that sweet undertone she still couldn't name. Stronger this time? Or perhaps she was more alert to it. She stood in front of C7's door and breathed it in and tried to think it through. Unit C7 was one of the legacy holds. She pulled out her log and checked the intake records, which she'd been given access to as part of her security duties. C7 had been at Meridian for 11 years. It was the estate of a woman named Eleanor Marsh, held in legal dispute between 2 branches of a family who disagreed about the validity of a late amended will. The intake records noted the contents as furniture, personal effects, library, approximately 400 volumes, artwork, 12 pieces, and miscellaneous household items. The unit had not been accessed in 3 years, since the last court-appointed inspection. Library, Delia thought, approximately 400 volumes, old books that explained the smell. Maybe, if the climate control had fluctuated, if the seals on the unit weren't perfect, the smell of old books could potentially seep into the corridor. She found this explanation satisfying enough. She moved on. She finished her round. What she didn't let herself think about, not fully, was the other smell, the sweet undertone she couldn't name. Because she had been around death, had sat with her husband in the final weeks of his life, and she had a wordless, physical memory of certain smells from that time that she preferred not to examine directly. It took her until the third occurrence, 2 weeks later, to let herself acknowledge what the second smell was. Flowers. Old flowers. Dried flowers. Or flowers that had been placed somewhere long ago and preserved. The smell of a funeral arrangement kept past its time. The first escalation happened on a Monday night, 6 weeks into her employment. Delia was at the security console at 3 a.m, drinking her tea and listening to an audiobook about the history of architectural preservation. She had eclectic tastes when the camera feed for Wing C corridor flickered. Not the camera itself. The image didn't go to static. The feed stayed live, stayed clear, showed the empty Wing C corridor in its usual gray night vision resolution. But the image, the corridor, flickered, like a frame had been inserted into the feed that was slightly off from the frames around it. A single frame, maybe 2, where something in the image was different. Delia set down her tea and leaned toward the monitor. She wound the feed back. The system allowed real-time recording with a 30-second rewind buffer, and watched it again. There was a figure in the Wing C corridor. In one frame, literally one frame of footage, there was a figure standing in the Wing C corridor, outside Unit C7. It was there, and then it was not there. A single frame, maybe a 40th of a second of footage, showing a pale form in the corridor where nothing had been and nothing was. Delia rewound the buffer and watched it 3 more times. It was there each time, a pale, blurred shape, standing outside C7, visible in exactly one frame. She called Gerald. Gerald, to his credit, answered on the 3rd ring despite the hour, and listened carefully while she described what she was seeing. He walked her through the process of locking the footage clip. The system allowed segments to be preserved for later review, and told her he'd look at it in the morning. He also, without her having to ask, told her to walk Wing C and confirm that all unit locks were intact and undisturbed. She walked Wing C. She checked every lock, paying particular attention to C7 and the other legacy units at the far end. All locked, all undisturbed. The corridor was empty and quiet, and the smell, the old paper, and the dried flowers was there again, faint but present, drifting around Unit C7. She logged everything and went back to the office. Gerald reviewed the footage in the morning and called her that afternoon. He was calm about it, methodical. Camera artifacts, he said. Single-frame anomalies in digital footage were common, particularly with night vision cameras, and could be caused by anything from electrical interference to the camera's own processing algorithm trying to compensate for low light. He wasn't dismissing her concern, he said, but he also wasn't alarmed. Delia accepted this. She was a practical woman. She went back to work. She told me when recounting this period that she was aware of a kind of internal negotiation she was conducting with herself. On one side of the negotiation was her commitment to rationality, to the known and the explainable, to Gerald's maintenance issue explanations, and her own carefully catalogued list of ordinary causes for what she was experiencing. On the other side was something she didn't have a clean word. for a quality of attention she was developing toward Wing C, and specifically toward Unit C7, that had no professional justification. She found herself pausing outside C7 during rounds for a beat longer than necessary. She found herself noting the timestamp when she passed it, as if she were tracking something. She found herself, on nights when the smell was absent, slightly disappointed. She mentioned this to me as a point of self-awareness that she found uncomfortable. She said, "I wasn't afraid of it. That's what confused me. I should have been more afraid and less curious, probably. But there was something about it that felt communicative, like it was trying to show me something in a language I hadn't learned yet." The second escalation happened 2 nights later. She was doing her 4 a.m. round of Wing C. She'd added an extra pass to her schedule, putting herself a half hour ahead of her contracted round time, something she did without particular acknowledgement, that she was doing it because she was paying more attention now. And when she reached the far end of the wing, the cluster of legacy units, she stopped. The door of Unit C7 was not open. Let her be clear about this. The door was not open. The lock was intact. The alarm contact on the door frame showed green, indicating it was properly sealed. The door of C7 was completely, properly shut, but there was light coming from under it. A thin line of light, visible at the bottom of the door, where it met the floor. A warm, slightly yellowish light, the kind that a lamp might cast, not the cold bluish white of a fluorescent. Delia stood in the corridor and looked at the line of light for a full 30 seconds before she moved. She was cataloging her options. The unit was climate-controlled and sealed. There was no window. There should be no source of light inside. No electrical connections had been run to the units. The climate control was handled by the building's central system, not individual unit connections. There was physically no way for that unit to have interior lighting. She knocked on the door. She didn't know why she knocked. She told me later it was almost reflexive, the way you knock on a door before entering a room, even when you know you're the authority in the situation. She knocked twice, announced security, and waited. Silence from inside. She keyed her radio to reach the monitoring center. Meridian used an external security monitoring service during overnight hours that could dispatch police if needed, and described what she was seeing. The monitoring center told her to stand by and not to attempt to open the unit. The police arrived in 11 minutes. By the time they did, the light under the door of C7 was gone. The officers opened the unit. They had a court-authorized general access protocol for situations like this. The monitoring center had woken Gerald, who had provided authorization. Inside Unit C7, they found exactly what the intake records described: stacked furniture, shelves of books, boxed personal effects, wrapped artwork leaning against the walls. No person, no light source, no indication that anything inside the unit had been disturbed in any way. The unit was perfectly sealed. The books were perfectly still. The air inside was cold and clean and smelled, very faintly, of old paper. "You doing okay?" one of the officers asked Delia as they stood in the corridor afterward. He was older 50s, tired-looking, the kind of officer who'd seen enough to be more interested in people's well-being than in whether their reports made complete sense. "I know what I saw," Delia said. "I believe you," he told her, and the tone of his voice suggested that this was not a courtesy, that he had stood in enough strange places at enough strange hours to have developed a genuine humility about what he did and didn't know. The third escalation happened on a night when Delia had been working at Meridian for almost 3 months. She had, by this point, developed a particular consciousness of Unit C7 that she couldn't fully suppress. She found herself listening for sounds from its direction on every pass through Wing C. She found herself noting the smell-old paper, dried flowers each time she passed, tracking whether it was stronger or fainter, trying to find a pattern. She found herself looking at the camera feed for the Wing C corridor with a frequency that exceeded what her job required. On this particular night, a Tuesday, November, the air in Garland genuinely cold. Now she was at the console at 2:15 when she noticed something in the Wing C camera feed that she had to look at for a long time before she could be sure she was seeing it. In the footage of the empty Wing C corridor, very faintly, in the section of hallway directly in front of Unit C7, there was writing on the wall. Not dramatic writing. Not words scratched in paint or spray-painted graffiti. Writing that appeared to be on a piece of paper. A page, maybe, from one of the books inside the unit that had been slid under the gap at the bottom of the door and left just barely visible on the camera. A piece of paper, white against the gray floor, with dark text on it that the night vision camera was barely resolving. Delia stared at the monitor. Then she picked up her radio. "I need someone at my location," she said. "I need 2 people. I need Gerald, and I need the monitoring service to have officers ready. I need you all to understand that I'm not calling this in because I'm scared, and I'm not calling this in because I'm imagining things. I'm calling it in because there is a piece of paper in the Wing C corridor that was not there 20 minutes ago, and I need witnesses before I go near it." She waited. She did not move from the console. She kept her eyes on the Wing C camera until Gerald arrived, 45 minutes later, with 2 other Meridian staff members and a police officer. They went to Wing C together. They stood in front of Unit C7 together. They looked at the piece of paper on the floor. It was a page from a book, an old book, from the yellowing of the paper and the typeface, the kind of large print, carefully typeset page from a book produced in the mid-20th century. On the page was text from what appeared to be a novel, and the page, read in isolation, described a woman returning to a house that had been her mother's, finding it exactly as her mother had left it, and understanding, for the first time, that the house was not waiting to be sold, or cleared, or changed. It was waiting for something far more specific. One paragraph on the page had been underlined in pencil. The line read, "She knew then that the house recognized her, that all of her mother's things, the furniture, the curtains, the books on their shelves had been waiting not for any heir, but for the one who would simply sit down among them and understand what they meant." Gerald picked up the page with gloved hands and bagged it. The lock of Unit C7 was examined and found intact. No one could explain how a page from a sealed unit had appeared in the corridor. 3 days later, Delia handed in her resignation. She worked her last night. She had decided she would work it. She was a practical woman, and she honored her commitments. And she also, she admitted to me, felt that she owed it to herself to end the thing properly. She would do her last shift, and she would be composed, and she would leave at 7 a.m. like a professional. It was a quiet night, until it wasn't. She was at the console at 3:15 a.m., an hour into her last early morning stretch, when every camera in the building showed, simultaneously, a single frame of static. Not a malfunction she'd seen the malfunction before, had the reference point of the previous single-frame anomaly in Wing C, but a different quality. A full system event. Every camera, every feed, one frame of white static, and then clear again. Then the alarm contact on Unit C7 sounded. Not the perimeter alarm, just the contact sensor, indicating that the door had been opened. A brief, single pulse of the alarm, lasting maybe 2 seconds, and then silence again. Delia sat at the console and looked at the Wing C camera feed. The corridor was empty. The camera showed nothing. She did something she had not done before, had not been willing to do on any of the previous occasions. She got up from the console, and without calling anyone, without radioing the monitoring center, without waiting for backup, she walked to Wing C. She walked slowly. She told me this was important to her, that she did not run, that she did not want to run, that she needed to walk toward whatever this was with her eyes open and her mind clear, because she had spent 3 months being unsettled by this building. and she wanted, at least once, to face it directly. She turned into Wing C. The corridor was lit exactly as always. The units stood in their rows. At the far end, the cluster of legacy holds, and Unit C7. The door of C7 was open. Not ajar, open standing wide, the interior dark beyond it. Delia stopped walking. She stood in the corridor and looked at the open door, maybe 50 feet away, and she breathed, and she waited. And in the darkness, inside the open unit, something moved, not a person, not the clear movement of a person, a shifting the way things shift in a dark room when air moves through them, the way fabric moves when disturbed. Something in the unit, some hanging cloth, some fabric item among Eleanor Marsh's stored belongings, moved in the still air of the sealed corridor, in a room that had been closed for 11 years, and then was still again. Delia stood and looked. After a long moment, she said, out loud, to the dark doorway, and whatever was behind it, "I'm leaving." She said it the way you'd say it to a room you were walking out of. Informative, without apology. She turned around. She walked back to the office. She called the monitoring center and reported a door contact alarm, and an open unit, requested officers be dispatched, and waited in the office with the door closed until they arrived. The officers found the unit door open. They found the unit's interior undisturbed. They found the lock mechanism, showing no sign of forced entry, and no explanation for how a locked door with an intact contact alarm had come open. They found, in the very center of the unit floor, not near the door, not somewhere it might have fallen from the shelves, but in the center, in the open space where you'd stand if you were looking at the room, a single book, open, face down, spine up, the way you'd leave a book if you were setting it down mid-read to come back to it later. The book was from the shelves of Eleanor Marsh's library. It was a collection of letters, correspondence between Eleanor Marsh and her daughter over the course of many years, privately printed, the kind of thing families sometimes had made. The page it was open to was from a letter Eleanor had written to her daughter near the end of her life. No one read the full text of that letter. It was evidence in a strange incident report. But one officer, the same older officer who had come before, who had told Delia he believed her, read the opening lines before bagging it, and told Delia what they said. He said, the letter began with Eleanor Marsh writing to her daughter that she was not afraid, that the things she was leaving behind were not a burden to be managed, but a presence to be felt, and that she was leaving them with the confidence that someone would eventually understand this. Delia thanked him. She finished her shift. She left at 7 a.m. She has not been back. Meridian Storage Solutions is still operating in Garland, Texas. Unit C7 is still under legal hold, as far as Delia knows the last she heard. The family dispute over Eleanor Marsh's estate was still unresolved, still moving through the court system in the slow way that complex estates sometimes do. She thinks about Eleanor Marsh sometimes. Not in a frightened way, she says. In a thoughtful way. She thinks about a woman who spent her life accumulating, meaning 400 books, 12 pieces of art, furniture and objects, and the physical residue of a whole interior life, and who had those things locked in a temperature-controlled room in a commercial building while strangers argued over them in a courthouse. She thinks about what it would mean for things to wait, whether objects could carry something of the people they'd belong to, whether a room full of someone's life could, in some way she couldn't quantify or explain, remain occupied. She doesn't have an answer. She's a practical woman. But she did one thing after she left Meridian that she mentions only when asked directly. She went home to her house, the house that had felt too big since her husband's death, and she walked through every room, and she looked at everything in it. His books, his record collection, the mug he'd used every morning that she still hadn't moved from the cabinet. the reading chair that still held the impression of him. She looked at all of it, and she said, out loud, that she understood what it meant, that she wasn't going to manage it or clear it away, that she was going to live among it, because it was him, in the only form that remained. She told me the house felt different after that. Warmer. She said she couldn't explain it, and she'd stop trying to. I need a moment before this last story, and maybe you do too. Because what Delia found in that storage facility, what she walked toward in Wing C on her final night, is the kind of thing that can be turned over and examined from a dozen angles and still not fully resolve into anything comfortable. And yet her story, in a strange way, carries something that might be called tenderness. Our final story tonight carries no such warmth. Paul spent 18 months in a decommissioned hospital in rural Pennsylvania, and what he encountered there was not tender, and it was not waiting. And when I tell you he quit the profession after 22 years because of what happened in that building, I want you to understand that Paul is not a man who frightens easily. Or rather, he wasn't. Find a comfortable position. We're going to the last one now. Paul Garrett spent 22 years in private and institutional security before he took the contract at Hale Memorial Hospital. And in those 22 years, he had seen enough to have carefully sorted his experiences into categories. Things that were explicable. Things that were explicable but took longer. Things that required someone else's expertise to explain. And a very small Category 3 incidents. Over 22 years of things that had never been satisfactorily explained and that he simply lived with, the way a person lives with a tooth that aches sometimes and doesn't other times, and that the dentist can never find anything wrong with. He wants to be clear, a rational man. He was also an honest man. These two qualities, he believed, were not in conflict. Hale Memorial was a psychiatric hospital that had been built in the 1920s on a hillside outside a small town called Clarion, Pennsylvania. It was, and he says this with care, because he doesn't want to be glib about what the place had actually been. A state institution of the older sort. The kind of facility that existed before modern psychiatric treatment, where the approach to mental illness involved more containment than care, where patients spent years and sometimes lifetimes within the same walls, where the building itself had accumulated, over the better part of a century, an extraordinary weight of human experience. Hale Memorial was decommissioned in 2009 when the state closed several older facilities as part of a consolidation of psychiatric services. The closure was orderly and well-managed. Patients were transferred. Staff were given extended notice and assistance. The building was properly secured. It sat empty for several years, while the state worked through the slow process of deciding what to do with it. Redevelop, demolish, sell to a private developer, or maintain, in its current state, as a potential historic site. Because the building itself, a large, heavy, Romanesque structure with brick towers and arched windows, was architecturally significant. In the interim, a security contract was issued. Someone needed to keep an eye on the place, keep out vandals and curious teenagers and urban explorers, and the occasional journalist or documentary filmmaker who wanted to come poke around an old asylum. Paul's company won the bid, and Paul's company assigned Paul, partly because of his experience with institutional settings, and partly because, and he's honest about this too, the posting wasn't popular. Long drive, rural location, isolated. Night shifts in an empty psychiatric hospital, not a posting most people were eager for. Paul took it. He'd been in security long enough that he was, he thought, past being bothered by the things that bothered younger workers. Empty buildings didn't scare him. Darkness didn't scare him. The history of a place, even a difficult history, didn't scare him. He was practical and methodical and thorough, and he intended to do 18 months of steady, professional work in a quiet building and then retire. Hale Memorial was a large building, 5 wings, 3 stories each, connected by a central hub with a main entrance and administrative spaces. The wings were designated by compass direction: north, south, east, west, and a fifth wing that had been added in the 1960s called simply the New Wing, though it was 60 years old now. Each wing had contained different functions at different periods of the hospital's history: wards, treatment areas, recreational facilities, therapeutic spaces. By the time of its closure, the building had been partially modernized. Some hallways had fluorescent lighting over the old incandescent fixtures. Some rooms had updated plumbing, and the administrative areas had been fitted with the standard modern security and communication infrastructure. But the bones of the place were 1920s. Institutional construction. Thick plaster walls, original hardwood floors in the patient areas, original tile in the bathrooms, high ceilings with plaster molding, and tall windows with the original wavy glass that distorted the view of the hill and the trees beyond. Paul did a full orientation walk of the building before his first night shift, accompanied by a facilities manager named Keith, who was one of 2 state employees still assigned to the building. Keith was a compact, careful man who had worked at Hale Memorial for 15 years before its closure and had stayed on in the maintenance capacity. He knew every corner of the building. He walked Paul through the patrol route, the alarm contacts, the points of vulnerability, the broken windows in the east wing, a compromised exterior door on the loading dock side, a section of perimeter fence on the south side that a determined person had cut through twice in the previous year. Keith was straightforward and thorough and professional, and at the end of the orientation walk, as they stood in the main entrance lobby, with its high ceiling and its old institutional smell, floor wax and plaster, and something like old wool, he said one more thing to Paul. "The North Wing," he said. "Specifically the 3rd floor of the North Wing. I want to be straight with you about it." Paul waited. "I've been in this building for 15 years, Keith said. "I've been in every room. I'm not a man who believes in nonsense. But the North Wing 3rd floor..." He stopped and started again. "I stopped going up there. 3 years before the place closed, I stopped going up there and I found reasons to send other people when something needed checking. I'm not telling you not to patrol it. It's on your route, and you should. I'm just telling you, when you go up there and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't rationalize it. Just leave." Paul thanked him. He noted the advice. He filed it in the category of local superstition, the kind of thing that builds up around old buildings with difficult histories. The stories employees tell each other, the way a place is passed, creates a kind of psychological weather. His first month at Hale Memorial was uneventful. He learned the building the way he always learned buildings: carefully, thoroughly, with a professional appreciation for its specific character. He learned which floorboards creaked, in which sequences, which doors drifted open or shut in response to the building's air pressure, which windows rattled in the wind, and which were solid, where the exterior lights reached and where they didn't. He learned the building's vocabulary, and he grew comfortable in it. He patrolled the North Wing 3rd floor on every round. It was not, in his experience, meaningfully different from any other part of the building. It was a long corridor with patient room doors on both sides, the rooms empty now, some of them still containing old iron bed frames or institutional furniture that hadn't been worth removing. The corridor's windows looked out at the hillside and the trees. It was, if anything, quieter than other parts of the building, being on the 3rd floor and away from the road. It caught less ambient noise. He did not find it frightening. Then February came. The first thing Paul noticed was a sound that he heard on his second-to-last round of the night, at 4:30 a.m., on a night in the 2nd week of February. He was on the North Wing 3rd floor, walking the corridor from the stairwell end toward the far terminus, when he heard what he initially took to be the building settling. Hale Memorial was a 100-year-old structure, and it made sounds particularly in winter, when the temperature differentials between its thick exterior walls and its heated interior created stresses in the plaster and wood, ticking, creaking, the occasional sharp crack as a beam adjusted. Paul had cataloged all of these sounds in his first weeks and had stopped hearing them consciously in the way you stop consciously hearing familiar sounds. This sound was different in a way that took him a moment to identify. It was rhythmic, not the irregular, organic rhythm of a settling building, but something closer and more deliberate. A soft, even sound, repeating with perhaps 2 seconds between each repetition. He stopped walking and stood in the corridor and listened, and the sound continued, soft, regular, coming from somewhere ahead of him, in the direction of the far end of the hall. He walked toward it. As he walked, the sound resolved itself slightly. It was too quiet to be fully clear, but it had the character of something being moved against something else. Something dragged, or rocked, or slid. He walked the length of the corridor with his flashlight, searching the doorways, the alcoves, the spaces that weren't quite visible until he was directly in front of them, and as he moved, the sound stayed ahead of him, always a little further down the hall, always at the edge of his flashlight's reach. He reached the far end of the corridor, the last room on the right. The sound was coming from inside it. Paul stood at the doorway of the last room on the right side of the north wing, 3rd floor, and shone his flashlight inside. The room was empty. Iron bed frame, no mattress. Institutional dresser with 3 drawers, 2 open. Window with old wavy glass. The hillside and the winter trees visible as dark shapes against a darker sky. Nothing moved. The sound had stopped. He swept the flashlight across every corner, checked the closet, a narrow alcove behind a door that stood halfway open, and found nothing. He stood in the room for a full minute, listening. Silence. The sound was gone. He completed his round, logged nothing unusual. He chose not to log it because he had no specific observation to record beyond a sound that had ceased and finished his shift. The sound came back on each of the next 3 nights, always during his 4:30 round, always on the north wing 3rd floor, always moving ahead of him down the corridor, in a way that prevented him from ever closing the distance between himself and its source. On the 4th night, he tried varying his approach, entering the corridor from the far end rather than the stairwell end, and the sound was waiting for him. When he entered and moved away from him in the opposite direction, it knew which way he was coming. He logged it on the 4th night. He described it as recurring acoustic anomaly, north wing, 3F corridor, 0430 hours. Approximately, rhythmic sound, soft, moving, source not located, continuing to monitor. He didn't call Keith, didn't call the company, didn't call anyone. He was a rational man, and he was continuing to monitor. The 5th night, the sound was not there, nor the 6th. On the 7th night, walking the corridor in the ordinary quiet, he found himself listening for it, with more attention than he wanted to admit, and registered the absence of it as something between relief and disappointment. What he did not want to examine too carefully was the quality of the sound itself. He had described it in his log as rhythmic and soft. What he had not written down, what he wrote down in no document and told no one for months, was what it had most reminded him of. He was a man who had spent 22 years in institutional buildings. He had worked hospitals and schools and government facilities and office parks. He knew the sounds that built environments made. HVAC systems, pipework, electrical hum, whined through gaps in insulation, the expansion and contraction of materials under temperature changes. He knew all of those sounds. The sound in the north wing 3rd floor corridor had not been any of those things. It had been most reminiscent, he says this carefully, precisely of a person rocking in a chair. The small, rhythmic sound of a wooden chair shifting its weight forward and back on a wooden floor. That specific rhythm, that specific quality, he had heard it 4 nights in a row before it stopped, and by the end, he was certain enough of what it sounded like, that the certainty itself frightened him more than the sound had, because the corridor had no chairs, and the rooms had no chairs, and there had been no one there. On the 8th night, he found the door. It was at the far end of the corridor, the last door on the left, directly across from the room where the sound had seemed to originate. This door was different from all the other patient room doors on the floor. It was fitted with an additional external lock, a heavy padlock looped through a hasp that had been drilled into the door and the frame. The padlock was old and heavy, and it was locked. Paul had walked past this door dozens of times. He knew he had. He had walked this corridor on every shift since his first night at Hale Memorial. He would have wagered his career on the fact that he had noticed every door, every variation, every detail of this corridor. The padlock was new, or rather, the padlock was old, rusted, clearly not new, but it was new to this door. It had not been there before. He photographed it with his phone. He called Keith. Keith reached at 6:30 in the morning before his workday had properly started, listened to Paul's description, and then went quiet in a way that Paul found more alarming than any answer he might have given. "I'll come in," Keith said. "Don't touch it. Don't try to open it. I'll come in." Keith arrived at 8:15. He looked at the padlock for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "I put this on this door in 2007, 2 years before the hospital closed." "Why?" Paul asked. Keith looked at him. "Because of what's inside." "What's inside?" Keith didn't answer immediately. He touched the padlock with 2 fingers, testing its solidness, and then he stepped back from the door. The room behind this door was room 312. It was used for, he paused. In the older terminology, they called it quiet room management, seclusion. Patients who were presenting in ways that the staff at the time didn't know how to manage were placed in here. Another pause. It was used heavily in the early decades of the hospital. The time was at 9, less in the later years. When I put this lock on in 2007, it was because people who went into that room, staff, inspection teams, a reporter who got a tour once, were coming out disturbed. Not in a way anyone could explain. Disturbed in the way that you're disturbed when something has happened that your brain won't resolve properly. I told the administration it was a safety concern, a maintenance issue, and they let me lock it and leave it. "You locked it yourself," Paul said, "in 2007, and it's been locked since then." "Yes." "Then how is it here? I've been in this corridor every night for a month. I've walked past this door 40 times. The padlock was not there." Keith had no answer for this. His face, in the early morning light of the corridor, had the look of a man trying very hard to maintain the surface of a practical explanation over something that was resisting it. They stood in the corridor and looked at the locked door, and neither of them said what they were actually thinking. Paul will tell you, if you ask him directly, what he was thinking. He was thinking about the rhythm of 22 years, about all the strange things he had filed in that small category of unexplained incidents and lived with. He was thinking about the very particular quality of this building's history. Not just any old building, but a place where human suffering had been concentrated and contained over the course of a century. He was thinking about what Keith had said on the first night, that people who went into that room came out disturbed in ways they couldn't articulate. He was thinking that the padlock had not been on the door when he started working here. He was thinking that it had appeared, and he was thinking that objects do not appear. Objects are placed, and if no person had placed it, then the word for what had happened was not one that Paul, in 22 years of professional life, had ever had occasion to use. Keith had the padlock replaced with a new one, and had the door inspected by a structural engineer 2 weeks later. The structural engineer found nothing wrong with the room. He described it as a standard institutional space, somewhat smaller than the other patient rooms on the floor, with one window and bare plaster walls. He said there were marks on the floor that might have been from furniture that had been removed, and marks on the walls that he attributed to plaster degradation over many decades. He noted that the room had a particular acoustic quality. The walls and floor seemed to absorb sound more than the rooms around it, and he attributed this to the thickness of the plaster on the interior walls, which was unusual. Someone had reinforced the sound dampening of the room at some point in the building's history. Paul logged all of this. He continued his rounds. He continued to walk the north wing third floor. The second escalation began 3 weeks after the padlock incident. It started with the patient's notes. Hale Memorial had been decommissioned in 2009, and the patient's medical files had been properly transferred to the state's record system at that time. The physical records, the thick paper charts, the intake forms, the session notes had been boxed and archived, but the building itself still contained traces, notices on bulletin boards, informational posters on the walls, the occasional forgotten piece of paperwork. The kind of background noise of a formerly occupied institutional building, the human residue that doesn't quite get gathered up in a decommissioning. In the supply room at the far end of the second floor, a room Paul used occasionally as a rest point. In the middle of his rounds, there was a metal shelving unit that had been left behind, and on the bottom shelf, there was a box of papers that had been there since he'd arrived. He'd looked in the box on his first week. Miscellaneous administrative forms, nothing significant, the kind of paperwork that gets orphaned at the end of any large-scale process. On a night in late February, he went to the supply room, and the box was on the floor. In the center of the room, open. Its contents spread around it, not scattered randomly. Spread as if someone had been looking through them, had sorted them, had arranged the papers in a deliberate way. Several sheets were laid out on the floor in a rough grouping that, when Paul looked at it carefully with his flashlight, appeared to be organized by something he couldn't immediately identify. He didn't touch them. He took photographs. He called Keith. When Keith arrived the next morning and they looked at the papers together, Keith identified the organizing principle. The papers were all related to the north wing third floor. Maintenance requests for room 312. A partially completed inspection form for the third floor corridor, a staff schedule from the early 2000s that listed assignments by wing, with the north wing third floor column largely blank, a pattern that Keith, staring at it, said he recognized. "We stopped sending staff up there alone," he said quietly. "After a while, we started sending 2 people when we needed to do anything up there." "Why didn't you tell me this before my first shift?" Paul asked. Keith looked at him. "I told you the third floor of the north wing. I told you to trust the feeling and leave. You didn't tell me there was a history." "There's always a history," Keith said. "In a building like this, there's always a history. I didn't tell you the specifics because I thought the specifics would make it worse." He looked at the papers on the floor. "I still think that." The third escalation was the one that ended it. Paul was on his 4:30 round, north wing, third floor, 6 weeks after the padlock incident. He was walking the corridor from the stairwell, moving toward the far end, and the corridor was quiet and still, and the winter was fully settled now, and the old wavy glass windows were dark, and the hillside outside was invisible in the black. He walked with his flashlight and his radio and his 22 years of professional experience, and he got to the far end of the corridor where the 2 doors faced each other, the room where the sound had seemed to come from, and the door with the padlock, and he stopped. The padlock was open. The hasp hung loose. The padlock itself was still attached, but the shackle was released, the lock hanging open. The door to room 312 stood slightly ajar, a crack of darkness in the narrow opening. Paul stood in the corridor and looked at it. The rational part of his brain said, "Someone has been in this building. Someone got in through the compromised fence or the loading dock door or some entry point he hadn't found, and they came up here and they opened this room." The previous strangeness, the moving sound, the padlock appearing, the papers had a person behind it, or multiple people, and they were in the building right now, and his job was to find them. The other part of his brain, the part that had 22 years of night shifts and dark buildings, and the particular intelligence that develops from long experience in spaces where things are sometimes wrong, was saying something different. It was saying, "There is no one in this building. You know this building. You have spent months learning it. If there were a person here, you would have heard them, sensed them, found their trace. There is no one here," which means the door opened by itself. He got on his radio and called for police backup. He did this before he did anything else. He stood in the corridor and waited, and while he waited, he looked at the crack of darkness at the edge of the door, and he did not open it, and he did not look away from it. It took the officers 19 minutes to arrive. 2 officers came. Paul showed them the door with the open padlock and the crack of darkness, and the officers, a man named Trooper Willis and his partner, prepared to enter room 312, and Paul stood back in the corridor and let them handle it. He told me later that in that moment, standing in the corridor while 2 state troopers prepared to open the door of room 312, he experienced something he had not expected, a powerful, physical reluctance to let them open it. Not fear of what might be inside. Something more specific than that. A sense that opening that door was the wrong action. That whatever was in that room, or whatever quality the room had, was not meant to be encountered directly. That it had, in some wordless way he couldn't justify, earned its locked door. He didn't voice this. He stood back and let them open the door. They went in with their flashlights, and he heard them moving around inside. Heard the measured, careful sounds of a search. Heard Trooper Willis say, "Clear," in the flat, professional tone of a man who has said that word in many rooms. Then silence for a moment. Then Willis speaking again, but not the professional, clear voice. Something quieter. "Garrett, come look at this." Paul went to the doorway of room 312. The room was small, as the structural engineer had noted. Bare plaster walls, bare wooden floor, one window with the old wavy glass showing the dark hillside, smaller than the other rooms. The acoustic quality was immediately apparent. Their voices seemed to go nowhere, to be absorbed by the walls before they could properly echo. In the center of the floor, there were marks. Not scratches or damage. Paul wants to be precise about this. Marks, made in something that might have been chalk or a soft clay compound, on the wooden floorboards. They formed a rough circle maybe 4 feet in diameter, and inside the circle, there were lines and shapes that were not legible as language, but that had the quality of intentional marking. Someone had made them deliberately, had put thought into their arrangement. Around the outside of the circle, at intervals, were small objects, pebbles, or perhaps the plaster chips from the walls, arranged at precise and equal intervals. In the center of the circle was a single sheet of paper. Paul crossed the room and crouched over the paper. His flashlight showed it to be a page from a patient file, an old file, the paper yellowed and brittle at the edges, the typeface institutional, a patient intake form from the 1940s. The form itself was mostly redacted. Someone had crossed out the name and identifying information at some point in the file's history, but some handwritten notes in the margins were still legible. The notes were written in a small, careful hand. They described a patient not by name, who insisted that room 312 was not empty, who said repeatedly that there was something in the room that the staff couldn't see, who said that the something was not malevolent. The patient's word, apparently, was recorded, and it was that word, malevolent, but that it was present in the way that grief is present, pervasive, undirectable, something that had accumulated in the room over time and had nowhere else to go. The patient, according to the margin notes, had insisted on being transferred out of room 312 specifically. When asked why, the patient had said, "It wants to be heard, and I don't know what to tell it." Paul stood up. He looked at Trooper Willis, who was looking at the circle of marks and the arrangement of stones with the expression of a man who had decided to be professionally neutral about something that was making him deeply uneasy. "I want you to know," Paul said to him, "that I did not make this." "I know that," Willis said. "I want you to know that no one else has authorized access to this building." "I know that too." They stood in room 312 for a moment, the two of them, and the room absorbed their voices and gave nothing back. And the wavy glass window showed the dark hillside and the bare winter trees, and the circle of marks on the floor was exactly what it was, which was something that had no business being there. Paul took photographs. Willis took photographs. They locked the door again, the new padlock had its key, and Willis kept the chain of custody of the photographs, and they completed their post-incident paperwork in the corridor outside. As Willis was finishing his report, he asked Paul, "How long have you been here?" 6 months at this posting," Paul said. 22 years in the profession." Willis nodded. He looked at the locked door. "You going to keep this posting?" Paul thought about it. He thought about the sound he'd heard, moving down the corridor. He thought about the padlock appearing and disappearing. He thought about the papers arranged on the supply room floor. He thought about room 312 and the note about a patient who said the room wanted to be heard and didn't know how to answer it. He said, "I don't think I am." He gave his notice the following week. Paul retired from the security profession the following spring. He'd been planning to retire in 18 months anyway. He moved that timeline up by a year. He lives in western Pennsylvania now, in a house he shares with his wife and 2 aging dogs. And he gardens and reads and does occasional consulting work for security firms that want the benefit of his experience without the night shifts. He has told very few people the full account of what happened at Hale Memorial, not because he's ashamed of it, and not because he fears people won't believe him. He's past caring, he says, whether people believe him. It's because the story doesn't resolve. The circle of marks in room 312 was never explained. No person was ever identified as having accessed the building. The padlock incident, how a lock installed in 2007 could appear in a corridor that Paul walked nightly and then be found open, was never explained. The sound in the corridor was never identified. He thinks about the patient's margin notes sometimes. The patient who said, "It wants to be heard, and I don't know what to tell it." Paul has a theory, and he offers it carefully, with the caveat that he's a practical man, and this is the most impractical thought he's ever had about anything. His theory is that Hale Memorial, that specifically room 312, had accumulated something over its century of existence. Not a ghost, not a presence with agency or intention, something more like, and he pauses here, choosing his words in echo, the way a room can carry the acoustic signature of a concert long after the music has stopped. Except what had echoed in room 312 wasn't sound. It was whatever had happened there. The weight of a century of difficult human experience, still reverberating in the walls. He thinks the patients who were disturbed by the room weren't disturbed by something supernatural. They were disturbed by something historical, by the pressure of all that accumulated past, pressing outward. He thinks whatever moved the papers and opened the padlock and walked the corridor was not trying to frighten anyone. He thinks it was doing what the patient's note said, trying to be heard. The tragedy, as Paul sees it, is that nobody knew what to say back. He said goodbye to the building on his last night. He doesn't mean this metaphorically. He walked the full circuit of Hale Memorial at 5 in the morning, an hour before his last shift ended, and he walked the north wing, 3rd floor, and he stopped outside room 312, and he said, out loud, "I heard you. I'm sorry I don't know what you need. I hope someone figures it out." He waited. The corridor was quiet. Nothing moved or sounded. The room behind the padlocked door gave no response. But he noticed something when he turned to leave, something small. The kind of detail that you notice only when you've been trained to look carefully at your environment and have spent months learning a building's specific language. On the floor of the corridor, directly in front of room 312's door, in the faint dust that had settled there over the weeks since the last custodial cleaning. There was a pattern, not marks, not scratches, not anything deliberate that he could point to and say unambiguously that it had been made with intention. A pattern in the dust, the way dust sometimes settles and is disturbed and resettles in ways that suggest the movement of air or the passage of something through the air. The pattern, if you looked at it in the angle of his flashlight, was circular. A rough, uneven circle in the dust, maybe 2 feet across, like something had moved through the corridor at that spot, had turned there, and settled again. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he took a photograph. Then he walked down the stairwell and out of the building for the last time. He finished his circuit and left at 6 a.m. and didn't go back. Hale Memorial is still standing. The state has been considering its options for years. As of the last Paul heard, it remains under security contract, maintained and patrolled by night. He hopes whoever works the North Wing 3rd floor is paying attention. He hopes they know what to do when something wants to be heard. Thank you for staying with me tonight. I mean that in the most genuine way I know how to say it. You made it through Marcus walking the empty corridors of a mall and discovering that his familiar, comfortable world had been hosting something, someone, that had learned his patterns better than he'd ever learned its. You stayed with him in that basement, looking at the small camp behind the HVAC unit, understanding that safety can be an architecture of assumptions that someone else has been quietly studying from the inside. You stayed as Delia walked Wing C one final time, toward an open door in a sealed room, into the wordless communication of a woman who only wanted her things to be understood. And you were here for Paul, standing outside room 312 inches, the pre-dawn dark of a century-old building, saying goodbye to something that could only answer with silence. 3 security guards, 3 long nights, 3 places where the dark held more than any of them had bargained for. There's something specific about the night shift that I keep coming back to when I think about these stories. The people who work those hours, who choose or need to occupy the world in its emptiest state, develop a relationship with silence that most of us never will. They come to understand that silence is not absence. Silence is its own presence, with its own texture and weight and moods. A building at 3 in the morning is not the same as a building at 3 in the afternoon. Same walls, same floors, same rooms, and yet entirely different. There's a quality to the deep nighttime hours that changes places, makes them somehow more themselves, strips away the noise of human occupation, and reveals the building underneath. Marcus knew this. Delia knew this. Paul knew this, better than most, and all 3 of them skilled, experienced, rational, professional people walked into that knowing and found it was not enough. I want to ask you something before you close your eyes tonight, and it's a question I've been sitting with since I first heard these stories. These people were all trained to observe, to question, to find logical explanations for what they saw. They were all people who knew how to be in the dark without flinching. And all 3 of them encountered something that their training and their experience and their rationality couldn't fully account for. What does that tell us about the spaces we think we know? About the places we believe are empty? About the difference between a space being unoccupied and a space being alone? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Have you ever worked a night shift somewhere and felt that particular quality of wrongness? Something you couldn't name but couldn't dismiss? Have you ever been in a building and sensed that the building was paying attention to you? Tell me. I read every single one, and some of your stories have become the inspiration for future videos. If you have an account of your own, share it. You might be our next story. If these stories found you tonight, please share them with someone who loves the dark as much as we do. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe. We have so many more nights planned, so many more stories waiting in the dark to be told. Ring the notification bell so you're always the first to know when we gather again. We'll be back soon. We always come back. But for now, sleep well, if you can. Check your locks. Listen to your building's sounds, the ones you've learned and cataloged and decided are normal. And if, somewhere in those familiar sounds, you hear something you don't recognize, something rhythmic and soft, something that stays just ahead of you no matter how quickly you walk, trust that feeling and leave. Good night, and sleep well.